the patterns of wind across the sea, the slow drift of clouds over the horizon. While other boys played, Napoleon listened to the rhythm of silence, to the stillness that hides within restlessness. He learned that solitude can be a kind of strength, that the quiet mind sees what others overlook. His mother, Letizia, strong and solemn, raised him with iron tenderness. She believed discipline was a form of love, and so he grew under the weight of both. At night, when the sea glimmered beneath the moon, he would stare into the distance and imagine worlds unseen, empires perhaps, though he did not yet know their shape. The stars above Corsica were not gentle. They burned fiercely, as if reminding him that destiny is not granted, but taken. His father, Carlo, filled their home with talk of politics and pride, the endless struggle of Corsica's identity between France and Italy. He listened, absorbing every word like kindling. Even then, he was learning to turn ideas into fire. When he was 9, his father sent him to France to study, a foreign land, a foreign tongue. The journey was harsh, the sea restless, and as the ship rocked beneath gray skies, he felt a deep, unshakable loneliness. In France, his accent betrayed him. The other boys mocked him, the Corsican savage, they called him. But ridicule only sharpened his resolve. The same isolation that once wounded him now became his weapon. He would learn faster, read deeper, think longer. He would rise above them all. In the quiet of his dormitory at Brienne, he devoured books. Caesar, Alexander, Plutarch. He read of men who bent fate to their will, and he began to wonder if such power could belong not just to kings or noble blood, but to anyone who dared to dream beyond their station. Sometimes he stood at the window, the winter light soft on his face, and whispered to himself, "One day." That word became his prayer, his promise, his shadow. Years passed, and the boy hardened into purpose. By 16, Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire in Paris, the youngest in his class. The city around him pulsed with change. The poor starved, while the rich danced in gold salons. France was a volcano beneath its silken mask, trembling toward eruption. He could feel it in the air, like electricity before a storm. He sensed, though he could not yet name it, that the world was about to break open, and that he, somehow, was meant to stand within that crack. Paris was not kind to him. He was poor, proud, and quiet. His uniform was threadbare, his meals often skipped. Yet he carried himself with the gravity of someone born to command. He walked the streets at dusk, watching the city shift from splendor to decay. The flicker of candles in windows, the smell of bread and smoke, the distant hum of carriages fading into the night. Sometimes he would stop by the Seine, gaze at the reflection of the moon, and feel the vastness of his own ambition. It frightened him, that hunger to be more than a man. When the revolution began, it felt to him like destiny calling. France tore itself apart, kings toppled, mobs shouted, blood flowed in the name of liberty. But amid chaos, Napoleon saw clarity. Where others saw danger, he saw the opening of history, his chance, his moment. At Toulon in 1793, when Royalist and British forces seized the port, a young artillery officer named Bonaparte proposed a plan so daring that it bordered on madness. Cannons placed where no one had imagined, firing in perfect unison under the cover of smoke and night. It was strategy turned into poetry. The plan worked. The British fled. Toulon fell. And the name, Napoleon Bonaparte, no longer Bonaparte, the foreigner, began to ripple through France like the first notes of an anthem. He was 24, thin, pale, eyes burning with restless intensity. France was starving for order, and in that hunger, it saw in him not just a soldier, but a savior. Promotion followed swiftly. He moved through ranks like wind through grass, unstoppable, unseen, inevitable. But victory awakened something deeper. It whispered of destiny, of greatness. And once a man begins to believe that fate favors him, the path forward becomes both luminous and perilous. Napoleon began to see not just battles, but patterns, maps of meaning, movements of nations like pieces on a chessboard. The revolution's fire became his forge, and ambition its flame. He fell briefly, politically exiled, his career nearly undone by the shifting tides of power. But even in despair, he did not break. He wrote, "I am made for great things, and until I accomplish them, all is misery." His conviction was no longer hope, it was faith. Then came Italy, the campaign that would turn him from a rising star into a legend. The army he inherited was starving, barefoot, hopeless. He promised them victory, glory, food, and gave them all three. In Lodi, he led from the front, crossing the bridge under fire, sword raised, his coat drenched in smoke and sweat. In that moment, he saw what others could not, that courage when bound to will can move mountains. His men began to follow him not for command, but for belief. They said he carried lightning in his voice, that when he spoke, the air itself seemed to listen. And perhaps it did. He made them dream that their suffering had meaning, that their struggle was a chapter in a story greater than themselves. Under his banner, they marched like believers following a prophet. In the quiet after each victory, Napoleon stood alone. The roar of battle faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through burned fields. He would watch the smoke rise and think of Corsica, of the sea, of the boy who once dreamed of stars. Now, the stars seemed closer, and yet farther than ever. He was no longer the child watching the horizon. He was the horizon itself. And yet, in that vastness, something gentle began to fade. The warmth that once lit his ambition turned colder, more calculating. He began to write less to his family, more to the future. To his mother he sent medals, to his brothers commands. The tenderness of youth was giving way to the machinery of power. And yet, on rare nights, when the sky was clear and the campfires low, he would stand beside his horse and gaze into the distance. The soldiers sleeping nearby would not see the shadow in his eyes, the quiet question that haunted him: if I conquer the world, will I still be alone? The fire that once burned to prove himself had become a flame consuming everything in its path. And somewhere, deep within that fire, the boy from the island still whispered to the man he was becoming, asking if all this was truly worth the silence it brought. The answer would take years to unfold, across continents, thrones, and graves. But already, history had chosen him, and like a tide that never retreats, it began to pull him toward destiny. As the night deepened and the smoke of victory rose into the stars, the world took its first quiet breath before the storm that would follow him. The boy from Corsica, once mocked, once forgotten, now stood at the threshold of empire. Chapter 2 the conqueror of Europe. Morning rose over Italy like a slow breath, pale gold spilling across the hills, the smell of earth and smoke lingering after battle. Napoleon stood at the edge of a ruined field, his coat fluttering in the wind, eyes fixed on the horizon. Around him, the landscape was quiet, as though holding its breath after the storm. He had done what few believed possible. France, once divided and starved, now stood victorious. Its soldiers, half naked and barefoot when they began, marched with pride and sang his name as if it were a prayer. Vive Bonaparte echoed through valleys like a hymn of rebirth. But even in triumph, his heart was restless. Victory had not satisfied the fire, it had fed it. The taste of power was intoxicating, and he began to crave not the end of conquest, but the next beginning. The Italian campaign had revealed to him something he had long suspected, that he was not merely to serve history, but to command it. He walked through the streets of Milan like a man both adored and feared. Crowds gathered to see him, to touch the hem of his uniform, to whisper that he was sent by Providence. And in the candlelit chambers of old palaces, where marble statues watched from the corners, he began to speak of things greater than battles, of Europe, of order, of destiny reborn from chaos. The air itself seemed to lean toward him when he spoke. He was small in stature, but his presence filled rooms like thunder waiting to break. His words came fast, sharp, alive, a mix of reason and poetry. He could silence generals twice his age with a glance. Even those who hated him could not ignore him. There was something magnetic, something inevitable about his will. And yet, in quieter hours, his pen revealed another man, one uncertain, longing, almost tender. His letters to Josephine brimmed with passion, jealousy, and loneliness. He adored her, though she would often wound him with silence. He wrote, "I wake thinking of you, and the earth seems empty when I do not find you beside me." But as the campaigns went on, her absence grew longer, her letters fewer, and a subtle ache began to root inside him, the loneliness of a man surrounded by worship, yet untouched by understanding. In Paris, the Directory trembled. The generals were growing too powerful, the people too restless. Napoleon returned like a storm to the capital, not as a soldier, but as a savior. The government paraded him through the streets, desperate to borrow his glory. He smiled, waved, but said little. His eyes, always scanning, saw weakness everywhere. France had won battles, but lost its soul. It was a nation without direction, leaders without vision, and he began to wonder, perhaps aloud, perhaps only in thought, if he might be the one to restore it. Then came Egypt, a dream dressed in sunlight and sand. He imagined himself not merely a conqueror, but a philosopher king, bringing civilization's torch to the east. His ship sailed across the glittering waters of the Mediterranean, carrying scholars, scientists, artists, an army of both war and wisdom. When they landed in Alexandria, he told his men, "From the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries looked down upon you." The words rang like prophecy. The desert tested him in ways Europe never had. The heat was relentless, the horizon endless, the silence deeper than prayer. Battles raged against the Mamluks and the Ottomans, victories carved in dust and blood. Yet amid triumph, he found wonder. The stars burning brighter than anywhere he had seen, the ancient stones of temples whispering secrets older than kings. He studied hieroglyphs, questioned astronomers, walked among ruins, and felt, perhaps for the first time, the humility of time itself. But time is a patient thief. While he chased glory beneath Egyptian suns, Europe changed without him. The British destroyed his fleet at Aboukir Bay, cutting him off from France. The Directory back home grew weaker still, collapsing under corruption, and whispers reached him, Josephine's betrayal, her unfaithfulness while he was gone. The letters he wrote then were sharp, wounded things. He told her, "You weep, but your tears are false. I despise you, yet I love you still." The conqueror who had commanded armies now found himself defeated by the smallest of human frailties, love unreturned. It was perhaps his first true loss. And so he left Egypt as quietly as he had arrived, slipping past the British blockade under the cover of night. His men, bewildered and abandoned, called after him, but he did not turn back. The sea that had once carried him to adventure now carried him home to destiny. When he returned to France, the people were waiting. The nation was broken, weary, hungry for strength. The moment he stepped ashore, the air seemed to change. He was no longer merely a general. He was the embodiment of order. In the halls of power, conspiracies swirled like smoke. The coup of Brumaire was swift and bloodless. The old government fell without a cry. And when it was over, Napoleon stood in silence before the council, his hand resting inside his coat, his gaze unwavering. "Citizens," he said softly, "the revolution is over." And in that moment, the republic died, not in chaos, but in calm. He was 30 years old. The boy from Corsica had become the ruler of France. But even as his throne rose, shadows gathered. In the stillness of his study, long after midnight, he would sometimes walk to the window and stare out over Paris. The lamps glowed faintly through the fog, the city asleep beneath him. He felt both the master and the captive of his own dream. "I found the crown of France lying in the gutter, and I picked it up with the sword," he would later say. But even he did not know that the crown he grasped so easily would one day crush him beneath its weight. The conqueror had begun his ascent, and the world, trembling beneath his feet, could only watch. And so, as the night deepened, and the echoes of revolution faded into history's hum, the man who had once been an island child now held an entire continent in his hands, and still it was not enough. For when a man begins to conquer the world, he often discovers he is only fleeing himself. Chapter 3. The Emperor of Dreams. The streets of Paris pulsed with life, a rhythm both chaotic and precise, like the beating of a living organism. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones, vendors called their wares with practiced urgency, and children darted through alleys, their laughter a fragile counterpoint to the murmurs of politics and intrigue. Above it all, the Tuileries rose, a testament to ambition and order, a palace that mirrored the mind of the man who commanded it. Napoleon moved within that world as both conductor and participant, sensing the movements of men and nations as one might feel the swell and ebb of the tide. In his study, maps were spread like woven tapestries, each line and color representing the reach of empires and the ambitions of kings. Letters from distant capitals lay in neat stacks, bearing news of alliances, rebellions, and betrayals. Napoleon's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the dispatches with a mixture of strategy and intuition. He could see not only the letters' words, but the intent behind them, the hesitation of a hesitant monarch, the hidden envy of a general, the treacherous delight of an enemy waiting for the opportune moment. Each decision, each order was a thread in the intricate web he wove across Europe. Yet even as he orchestrated the vast machinery of empire, There were moments when the man behind the myth could be glimpsed. Alone in his chambers, he would sometimes stare into the pale morning light filtering through tall windows, seeing not triumph, but the faces of those lost to war, the soldiers who fell in frozen fields, the civilians whose lives were swept away in the wake of his ambitions. These ghosts were silent, yet their presence lingered in the corners of his mind, shaping a ruler who could combine ruthlessness with unexpected empathy, ambition with a rare sensitivity to the human cost of power. Napoleon's genius was not only in strategy, but in perception. He understood that victory was as much a product of imagination as of artillery. To move an army was to move hearts. To bend the will of nations was to craft narratives that inspired awe and fear in equal measure. He was the emperor of dreams because he could make others believe in the impossible, see the world not only as it was, but as it might be if he willed it so. His soldiers marched not merely because of discipline, but because they followed a vision larger than themselves, a dream of glory that was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. Even in the corridors of power, his presence was magnetic. Ministers, marshals, and diplomats felt the pull of his mind, a force that could dominate conversation, bend debate, and unearth hidden truths with a single question or glance. Some revered him, others feared him, but all knew that to underestimate Napoleon was to court disaster. His reputation had become a weapon in itself, spreading across courts and capitals like wildfire, shaping alliances and stoking apprehension far from the fields of battle. The city itself seemed to mirror the paradox of its emperor, grand, ordered, yet alive with undercurrents of unrest. Cafes and salons buzzed with the chatter of citizens, gossip laced with hope, envy, and apprehension. Revolution had not died, it had transformed, and in its new form, it required both the hand of a firm ruler and the vision of a dreamer. Napoleon navigated this delicate balance with the precision of a master craftsman, shaping public perception while guiding policy, bending loyalty without breaking it. Yet even mastery demanded vigilance. Letters from Vienna hinted at conspiracies, the distant mutterings of generals questioned his authority, and across the continent, the restless ambitions of monarchs simmered beneath polite diplomacy. Napoleon understood that empires were won not only through cannon and sword, but through the architecture of trust, the careful cultivation of belief, and the silent manipulation of perception. One step, one misjudged word, and the fragile edifice of his dominion could collapse. Still, for all the weight of power, Napoleon never lost the intimacy of imagination. In the quiet hours, when the empire slumbered, he imagined the possibilities of the future, the campaigns that might extend his influence, the treaties that might secure his legacy, the legends that might immortalize him. His mind was a battlefield of visions, each more ambitious than the last, a place where strategy and fantasy intertwined until they became indistinguishable. In these moments, he was not merely a man, but an idea, a force of will capable of shaping the destiny of nations. And yet, with all his grandeur, there remained solitude. Surrounded by advisors and generals, cheered by citizens, he knew the emperor's burden could be borne only alone. In the silence of his chambers, the mind that commanded Europe wrestled with questions no victory could answer. What is the measure of power? What is the cost of ambition? And what, in the end, is the fate of a man who dares to bend the world to his dreams? The morning deepened, and Paris glowed beneath the rising sun, gilding rooftops and river alike. Napoleon moved through the palace, through the city, through history itself, leaving traces that would echo long after he had passed. He was a man of contradictions, both human and legendary, a dreamer whose visions could build empires or shatter them, a soldier whose mind was a crucible of strategy and imagination. He was the emperor of dreams, and in every street, every letter, every silent glance, the world could feel the sweep of his ambition, the brilliance of his intellect, and the indelible mark of his presence upon history itself. The empire stretched across Europe, a mosaic of conquered lands and reluctant allies, yet for Napoleon, maps and borders were only the beginning. Each region had its own pulse, its own fears and loyalties, and the art of rule required sensing the subtleties invisible to most. In Italy, he navigated the delicate ambitions of local princes. In Egypt, he pondered the ancient sands that whispered of glory and ruin. In Austria, he balanced treaties with the ever-present threat of betrayal. Everywhere, he moved with the certainty of a man who believed that history itself could be guided by vision and will. War, of course, remained the ultimate test. Napoleon's campaigns were legendary, not only for their tactical brilliance, but for their psychological precision. At Austerlitz, he had deceived an entire coalition, making the enemy see weakness where there was none and opportunity where none existed. Armies moved like pieces on a board he could see in its entirety, yet each piece carried the lives of men who trusted him with their fates. Victory demanded calculation, yes, but also the ability to inspire loyalty and courage, to make men believe they were part of something greater than themselves, a dream made flesh on fields of mud, smoke, and cannon fire.
Yet battles were only part of the story. Napoleon understood that empires could falter not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who serve them. Diplomacy, alliances, marriages, decrees, and proclamations, all were instruments in the symphony of rule. He could charm a minister into loyalty, intimidate a king into submission, and manipulate a populace into devotion, and he did so with a brilliance that often seemed supernatural. But even he could not fully escape the fragility of human nature, and every decision carried the shadow of unintended consequence. Among those closest to him, the tension between admiration and fear was constant. Josephine, radiant and unpredictable, captivated him with the grace that could temper his stormiest moods. Yet even love required calculation. The heart, like the battlefield, was a space where errors could prove costly. His generals, brilliant and ambitious, watched and waited, measuring loyalty against personal ambition, their own dreams intertwining with the destiny of the empire. Napoleon moved among them like a conductor guiding a complex orchestra, attuned to every discordant note, ready to reshape the symphony before it fell into chaos. Even as he solidified power, Napoleon was haunted by the whispers of doubt and rumor. Europe's monarchs, bruised but unbowed, plotted, negotiated, and wove intrigues meant to unseat him. He knew that empires were temporary, that legends were fragile, and that every triumph could seed the conditions for downfall. And yet, within him burned an audacity that refused to yield to fear, a conviction that he could shape the course of history with the same certainty he had once shaped the destiny of a single battalion. At night, the emperor often wandered the halls of the Tuileries alone, listening to the city breathe beneath him. The soft hum of Paris, the distant clatter of hooves, the muted cries of joy and despair, all were part of the rhythm he had learned to feel as instinctively as his own heartbeat. In those hours he was both man and myth, aware of his mortality and yet compelled by the enormity of his vision. He dreamed not only of empires, but of immortality, not only of conquest, but of a legacy that would outlast crowns, cannons, and centuries. The world outside was restless, Revolutions flickered like storm lanterns in Spain and Naples. The seas teemed with the fleets of Britain, ever watchful and unyielding. Yet Napoleon moved with the fluidity of a mind attuned to possibility. He saw opportunity where others saw danger, turning political crises into strategic advantage, transforming setbacks into lessons, and weaving every experience into the narrative of his ambition. Even with such extraordinary vision, the emperor's humanity remained palpable. In quiet moments, he pondered the cost of his dreams, the bloodshed, the families disrupted, the lives forever altered by the march of armies and the decree of law. He was neither callous nor detached. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that greatness demanded sacrifice. And yet, that sacrifice was not abstract. It was lived and felt by countless individuals whose fates he bore upon his conscience. And still he pressed forward. Paris, vibrant and restless, was his stage, but Europe was the theatre of his imagination. His mind leapt across mountains, rivers, and borders, seeing battles before they occurred, anticipating moves and countermoves with the precision of a master strategist. Generals deferred to his judgment, ministers relied on his vision, and even rivals could not fully comprehend the speed and scope of his intellect. Napoleon was a storm contained within the body of a man, a tempest that reshaped the world with every decision, every word, every command. As the chapter of morning turned to afternoon and afternoon to evening, Napoleon's empire continued its relentless expansion, not merely in territory, but in myth, in imagination, in the very consciousness of Europe. He was a man whose dreams could alter reality, whose vision could bend nations, and whose ambition illuminated the sky like a comet streaking across the night. Yet even in his brilliance, there lingered the quiet question that shadowed all great men. How long could a dream endure before the weight of the world pressed it to the ground? Paris, lit now by the golden hue of dusk, held its breath as if sensing the significance of every footstep in the palace, every whisper in the streets. Napoleon walked through the corridors, through the empire, through history itself, and in his wake he left traces that would echo far beyond the limits of time. He was, in every sense, the emperor of dreams, a man who conjured empires from thought, who commanded devotion from millions, who transformed the fragile and fleeting into something enduring and monumental. And in that brilliance, haunted, solitary, unstoppable, he was poised to shape the world, one dream, one victory, one irrevocable moment at a time. Chapter 4. The Iron Tide. The roar of cannons echoed across distant fields like the heartbeat of a restless continent. Napoleon Bonaparte, ever the master of strategy and spectacle, stood upon a ridge overlooking the French armies, his figure a dark silhouette against the pale dawn. The air smelled of gunpowder, wet earth, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Yet, even amidst the chaos of war, there was a strange clarity, a rhythm, a pattern, a logic that only he could perceive. Armies moved as he imagined them, not merely as men and horses, but as extensions of his will. Each battalion a stroke of genius upon the vast canvas of Europe. The iron tide, as contemporaries would later call it, swept through nations with relentless force. From the snow-swept plains of Austria to the winding rivers of Italy,
Napoleon's campaigns reshaped borders, toppled dynasties, and forced reluctant allies into submission. At Austerlitz, he had demonstrated the terrifying poetry of warfare, deceiving entire coalitions with precision that seemed almost supernatural. But victory was never simple, and even triumph carried its own burdens. The field, littered with the casualties of ambition, whispered reminders of mortality, a silent chorus to temper the umpire's grandeur. Napoleon's mind was a crucible of calculation. Each maneuver, each strategy was infused with an acute awareness of psychology as much as logistics. He understood that armies could be broken not only by musket and cannon, but by doubt, fear, and awe. Soldiers marched harder when inspired, retreated sooner when demoralized, and he, more than any general in history, knew how to bend human will to his designs. Letters from generals, intelligence reports from spies, and whispers from occupied cities were all pieces of a puzzle he solved with uncanny clarity. Europe was not merely a map. It was a living, breathing organism, and he had learned to feel its pulse.
Yet the higher he climbed, the more precarious his position became. Victory bred envy and fear in equal measure. Kings plotted in shadows, ministers whispered treachery, and rival empires watched the spread of French influence with suspicion and malice. Napoleon knew that the true challenge of power was not the enemy at the front lines, but the one behind the walls of diplomacy, hidden in the smiles of allies and the subtle gestures of those sworn to loyalty. To rule, he realized, was to navigate a river of knives and mirrors, where one misstep could undo a lifetime of conquest. Even in the midst of war, Paris remained his anchor. The Tuileries Palace, the Seine's reflective calm, the bustling streets and markets, all these reminded him of the stakes beyond the battlefield. Soldiers fought, yes, but nations lived and breathed. Politics, commerce, and public sentiment were as vital to victory as any army. He wrote decrees with the same intensity he commanded armies, knowing that a law or proclamation could shape a city as much as a cannonball shaped a field. Each word, each signature, carried the weight of empires. Napoleon's personal world, too, was a landscape of contradictions. Josephine, with her grace and unpredictable charm, remained both solace and temptation. Their love, passionate and tempestuous, mirrored the conflicts of the empire, intense, consuming, and sometimes painfully fragile. Generals and ministers were loyal, but loyalty was a complex dance of respect, fear, and ambition. Every interaction required careful observation. Every word could inspire or betray, and Napoleon moved through these relationships with the same meticulous precision that guided his armies. As the Iron Tide surged, the human cost became unavoidable. The smoke of battle, the cries of the wounded, the hollow-eyed survivors, they were reminders that empires were not abstract constructs, but lived realities. He felt their weight with the soldier's discipline and the philosopher's reflection. For every victory, there was loss. For every conquered city, a population adjusting to new rulers. His mind never stopped calculating, never stopped imagining, never stopped weighing consequence against ambition. The campaigns themselves were spectacles of speed, coordination, and audacity. Columns of infantry, cavalry charges, and artillery barrages unfolded with a precision that bewildered allies and enemies alike. Napoleon's ability to anticipate movements, to see several steps ahead, to manipulate terrain and time, made him appear almost superhuman. Yet even as victories piled up, he knew that the tide of war was never infinite, that fortune favored the bold only so long, and that every campaign sowed the seeds of future struggles. Across Europe, whispers of the emperor's ambition grew louder. In Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg, rulers feared not only his armies, but the idea of him, a man capable of bending nations to his will, capable of reshaping history itself. The Iron Tide was more than military conquest. It was a psychological force, a wave of inevitability that made resistance seem almost futile. Yet Napoleon never underestimated the power of human resilience. He respected it, calculated it, and often used it against itself, turning fear into leverage, hesitation into opportunity. Even in triumph, the emperor remained a man of reflection and solitude. Nights in his chambers were filled with contemplation of what had been gained and what had been lost. He considered not only the maps and victories, but the fleeting nature of time, the fragile thread that connected ambition to mortality. Greatness demanded sacrifice, and he carried the weight of lives and history with a constant, disciplined awareness. He knew that empires were temporary, but the impression of a life, a vision, could echo far beyond the fall of kings or the boundaries of borders. As dusk fell across the fields of Europe, Napoleon stood upon another ridge, the wind carrying the scent of gunpowder and earth. Below him, armies rested and cities waited, the world suspended in the tension between conquest and survival. He was the master of the Iron Tide, the force beyond the momentum of history, a man whose mind and ambition shaped the destiny of nations. Yet in the quiet of evening, even amid the brilliance of strategy and the poetry of victory, he carried the solitary knowledge that power, for all its grandeur, was fragile, and that every triumph contained the seeds of challenge to come. Napoleon moved onward through campaigns, through diplomacy, through history itself, leaving in his wake the mark of a man who dared to dream beyond the possible. He was the emperor of an unstoppable tide, a force that reshaped continents and minds alike. Yet even he, brilliant and audacious, understood that the world he commanded was as unpredictable as it was vast, as beautiful as it was perilous. The Iron Tide surged, unstoppable yet uncertain, and Napoleon, at its crest, continued to dream, to conquer, and to shape the world according to the vision of a man who refused to be anything less than legendary. Chapter 5. The Waning Horizon. Europe had grown restless. The very lands Napoleon had conquered, once subdued by the speed and brilliance of his campaigns, now simmered with resentment and ambition. In cities from Madrid to Moscow, whispers of defiance rippled through the streets, carried by merchants, soldiers, and ordinary citizens alike. Even the strongest walls could not contain the tide of human will, and Napoleon, despite his genius, sensed the subtle, inexorable pull of forces beyond his control. The horizon that once promised endless triumph now trembled with uncertainty. From the heights of the Tuileries, Napoleon surveyed his empire as a man might survey a vast garden, both cultivated and wild. Maps sprawled across tables like rivers of ink, marking victories, borders, and supply lines. Yet the brilliance of conquest could not erase the human reality beneath. Armies weary from campaigns, nations strained under taxation, and the quiet murmurs of rebellion in distant provinces. Strategy alone could not conquer hearts, and Napoleon had learned that control, however absolute it appeared, was always provisional. The campaign in Spain had become a war of attrition unlike any he had faced. Guerrilla fighters, invisible and relentless, struck at convoys and outposts, undermining morale and spreading fear through villages long accustomed to stability. Each skirmish, each raid, was a reminder that power was not only won by the sword, but constantly defended against ingenuity and resistance. Napoleon, used to the rhythm of decisive battlefield victories, felt the slow, grinding uncertainty of a war that could not be swiftly concluded. Even more perilous was the looming specter of Russia. Reports of vast armies, icy expanses, and shifting allegiances arrived like warnings carried on the wind. Moscow, a city both magnificent and merciless, awaited with the promise of glory or disaster. Napoleon, ever bold, saw opportunity in the harshness of winter, but the risk was immense. He calculated supply lines, troop morale, and the political consequences of delay or retreat. The mind that had once orchestrated lightning campaigns now had to wrestle with the cold, indifferent continent that refused to bend so easily to human will. In the midst of these challenges, Napoleon remained both man and myth. His presence inspired devotion, fear, and awe. Yet even the most loyal generals began to sense the weight of overreach. Ambition, once the engine of rapid conquest, now pressed against limits that were tangible and unforgiving. He could still command armies with brilliance, negotiate treaties with cunning, and manipulate perception with subtle genius. But the strain was visible even to those who revered him. The emperor was a human mind confronting the immensity of his own creation. Back in Paris, life continued with a fragile veneer of normalcy. The city shimmered with culture, commerce, and political maneuvering. Yet beneath the surface, anxiety gnawed at the populace. Citizens, once captivated by the majesty of empire, now felt the pressure of taxes, conscription, and endless war. Ministers and courtiers whispered in cautious tones, aware that one misstep could unravel the careful balance Napoleon had constructed. Even allies, whose loyalty had seemed assured, began to calculate their own survival and advantage. In this delicate lattice of power, every decision carried risk, and every triumph was shadowed by potential failure. Josephine remained a quiet, poignant presence in Napoleon's life, a tether to the human world, beyond strategy and ambition. Their love, though tested by distance, politics, and personal ambition, offered moments of reflection and tenderness. She reminded him, in subtle ways, that even emperors are mortal, that even the grandest vision,
The hidden sufferings of the rungs below, the lived in the smallest gestures. Yet the demands of empire allowed little room for intimacy. Ambition demanded focus, and the human heart, no matter how ardent, could never compete with the relentless march of history. The Russian winter approached like a silent predator, indifferent to glory or genius. Napoleon prepared his armies with meticulous care, aware that courage alone would not suffice against frost, hunger, and the cunning of an enemy who refused to fight on his terms. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of leagues. Morale wavered under the cold, and the vastness of the land became as much an adversary as any opposing general. For the first time in his career, the genius of Napoleon faced limits imposed not by intellect, but by circumstance, geography, and the inexorable laws of nature. The horizon, once a canvas for conquest, now lay shrouded in white. Snow fell steadily over the vast Russian plains, blanketing rivers, forests, and villages in a silence that was at once beautiful and merciless. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, stood atop a frozen ridge, surveying the landscape with the same intensity he had once brought to the battlefields of Austerlitz and Ulm. But here, in this endless expanse of frost and wind, he faced a foe unlike any before, the inexorable weight of nature itself. The Grande Armée had marched with confidence, a tide of ambition sweeping across Europe. Soldiers inspired by the genius of their commander had believed themselves invincible. But the vastness of Russia, the cunning of its generals, and the severity of winter revealed limits that no brilliance could fully overcome.
Roads became rivers of mud, supply lines stretched beyond endurance, and morale waned as the biting cold gnawed at flesh and spirit alike. Each step forward was a struggle. Each decision carried consequences measured not only in lives, but in the fragile thread of hope itself. Napoleon's mind, always active, calculated endlessly. Routes of retreat, potential crossings of frozen rivers, supply depots, and alternative strategies all were weighed against time, weather, and the unpredictable resilience of the Russian people. Yet even the most meticulous planning faltered before a winter that seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance. The mind that had orchestrated the lightning campaigns of Europe now confronted a reality shaped not by tactics alone, but by frost, hunger, and the sheer scale of the land. Moscow awaited, a city both magnificent and symbolic, the prize that promised glory yet concealed disaster. When the French entered, the city lay in flames, a deliberate destruction that robbed the emperor of the triumph he had envisioned. Palaces burned, streets were abandoned, and the ghost of victory mingled with the acrid smoke that curled into the sky. Napoleon, accustomed to orchestrating destiny, felt the bitter sting of forces he could not fully control. Fire and frost had combined to render strategy nearly meaningless, leaving only endurance and resolve as instruments of survival. The soldiers, once spirited and invincible, trudged through snow that reached their knees, their boots soaked and their hands numb. Frost-bitten faces, hollow eyes, and silent suffering marked every march, a living testament to the limits of ambition. The Grande Armée, which had swept through Europe like an unstoppable force, was now reduced to fragile columns of human endurance, pressed on like discipline, loyalty, and the sheer force of will. Napoleon, ever vigilant, rode among them, sharing the cold, the hunger, and the burden, but knowing that even his presence could not shield them from the merciless elements. In these moments, the emperor's genius was both a weapon and a curse. He calculated every movement, every potential retreat, every survival strategy. But the vastness of the land and the severity of the cold were adversaries beyond the reach of intellect alone. Supplies dwindled, horses fell, and the psychological toll weighed heavily on the men who had once followed him with unshakable faith. Napoleon, who had conquered Europe with precision and speed, now confronted the slow, grinding attrition of winter, a test of endurance, courage, and humility. In the midst of the suffering, moments of human resilience shone through. Soldiers shared rations, kindled small fires, and sang quietly to ward off despair. Napoleon witnessed both the fragility and the fortitude of those who had entrusted their lives to his vision. Each act of perseverance was a small victory, yet it could not erase the enormity of the challenge. The glory of the army, which had once seemed limitless, was now measured in steps, in survival, in the ability to endure what should have been insurmountable. Moscow, deserted and burning, became a symbol not of triumph, but of the peril inherent in overreach. Napoleon walked the silent streets, imagining what could have been: a palace untouched, a city conquered with elegance, but the reality was stark. Ambition, unchecked by humility or circumstance, carries consequences as absolute as death. Here, in the heart of Russia, the emperor of dreams encountered the limits of human will, the fragility of even the greatest empires, and the unrelenting power of nature.
As the days passed, the retreat began, a march through snow and desolation, each mile a battle against frost, hunger, and exhaustion. The Grande Armée, once a tide of unstoppable ambition, dwindled under the weight of winter and the relentless attacks of a cunning enemy. Napoleon's mind remained sharp, his strategies precise, yet even the most brilliant commander could not alter the immutable laws of survival. The retreat was a crucible, testing the limits of endurance, leadership, and the human spirit. In the frozen silence, the emperor reflected upon the nature of power and ambition. Victory, he realized, is never guaranteed. Glory is never permanent. Even the most audacious dreams must reckon with reality, with circumstance, with forces beyond control. He had shaped Europe, bent nations, and inspired millions. Yet here, in the frost of Moscow, he confronted the immutable truth. Empires rise and fall, legends endure, but the human cost is eternal. As the first light of dawn illuminated the snow-bound plains, Napoleon's silhouette appeared against the horizon, a figure of determination, intellect, and relentless will. The Grande Armée, reduced but unbroken in spirit, followed him through hardship and despair. The frost of Moscow had tested the limits of ambition, yet even in adversity, the mind of Napoleon remained unbowed, calculating, dreaming, commanding. The empire he had forged faced peril, but the emperor of dreams endured, a man confronting the stark realities of history, human resilience, and the inexorable passage of time. The frost-bitten horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder of both mortality and resolve. Napoleon pressed onward, step by step, decision by decision, through snow, through suffering, through the delicate architecture of survival and ambition. The campaign would become legend not for victories won, but for the audacity to confront impossible odds, to endure beyond expectation, and to leave an indelible mark upon the world. In the icy vastness of Russia, the Emperor of Dreams faced his greatest challenge yet, and in doing so, revealed the fragile human heart behind the myth of genius. Chapter 7. Twilight of the Empire. The once resplendent halls of the Tuileries seemed smaller now, echoing with the weight of absence and defeat. Paris, vibrant and bustling only months before, carried a quiet tension, a sense of inevitability that even the most loyal citizens could not ignore. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, had returned from Russia not as an invincible conqueror, but as a man tempered and haunted by frost, fire, and loss. The empire he had built with lightning campaigns and audacious strategy now trembled under the pressure of overreach, betrayal, and relentless opposition. News from the front arrived like blows. Armies that had once marched with confidence were shattered, supply lines irreparably broken, and allies who had once bowed to his vision now whispered of opportunity, of alliances against him. Europe, which had seemed to bend beneath the force of his will, was reasserting itself with a resolve forged in resistance and survival. Even the generals who had once revered him now questioned, debated, and faltered, their faith strained by the cold reality of retreat and loss. Napoleon, ever aware of perception and morale, sensed the shifting tides before they became waves, yet the human cost of recalculation weighed upon him as heavily as any battlefield casualty. The retreat from Moscow had left indelible scars, not only upon the soldiers who had survived, frost-bitten and weary, but upon Napoleon himself. Each mile of snow-strewn plains had tested discipline, endurance, and willpower, revealing the fragility of even the most magnificent designs. Now,
Back in Paris, he faced a different type of battlefield: politics, public opinion, and the relentless advance of coalition forces determined to reclaim Europe from the ambitions of a single man. The iron tide he had once commanded with unstoppable momentum had met its counter, and the emperor could no longer rely solely on brilliance to secure victory. Diplomacy became urgent, fragile, and complex. Negotiations were conducted in whispers and letters, treaties signed with one hand while alliances were secretly undermined with the other. Napoleon, master of perception, maneuvered with the same precision he had once applied to artillery and infantry. Yet even the finest strategy could not guarantee the loyalty of men who now measured self-preservation above devotion. Kings and ministers, once intimidated by the sweep of his reputation, saw cracks in the myth and pressed forward with calculated aggression. The empire was being tested not only by war, but by the intricate, relentless machinery of politics, ambition, and survival. In the palace, Josephine remained a quiet presence, a reminder of love and mortality amidst the turbulence of history. Her grace and empathy contrasted the harsh calculus of empire, offering solace even as the tides of destiny surged. Napoleon's personal life, once vibrant with passion and ambition, had become a crucible of reflection and regret. The choices he had made, some brilliant, some brutal, were now measured against the weight of consequence, each loss magnified by the empire's diminishing reach. Even the greatest victories, he realized, could not erase the shadow of human cost. The battlefield itself was no longer the sole arbiter of power. Coalitions formed against him with unprecedented speed and cohesion. Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other powers, bruised but unbowed, coordinated strategies, anticipating his moves and exploiting the weaknesses exposed by Moscow. Napoleon's armies, diminished in number and spirit, struggled to maintain cohesion, morale, and supply. Victory, once swift and decisive, now required endurance against adversity that was as physical as it was psychological. Each battle carried the shadow of potential disaster, and every decision bore consequences measured in lives, cities, and the fragile survival of the empire. Napoleon's mind, always restless, calculated constantly. Retreats, counterattacks, strategic withdrawals, and defensive positions were considered with relentless precision. Yet even genius has limits, and the human and logistical cost of continued campaigns pressed upon him like an unyielding weight. He felt the fragility of power in the whispered doubts of generals, the apprehensive gaze of ministers, and the quiet anxiety of a populace aware that the empire's brilliance might be fading. The empire, like a candle against the wind, flickered under the pressure of forces it could no longer fully dominate.
Amidst this turbulence, Napoleon reflected on ambition itself. He had bent Europe to his vision, reshaped nations, and inspired awe and fear alike. Yet the very greatness that had carried him to heights unimaginable now revealed vulnerability. Power, he realized, was not eternal. Legends, no matter how luminous, could be challenged, eroded, and overturned. The brilliance of strategy, the audacity of vision, and the force of will were formidable, but they could not entirely contain the chaos of circumstance, the resilience of human resistance, or the inexorable tide of history. Paris, draped in winter's gray light, seemed quieter, more fragile than before. The streets still pulsed with life, yet beneath the surface, anxiety simmered. Citizens whispered rumors of coalition armies, of betrayals and losses, and of the emperor who had once seemed unstoppable, now facing the waning of fortune. Napoleon, aware of every glance, every murmur, every shadow,
continued to command, to plan, to inspire. But the certainty that had defined his reign was slipping, replaced by the constant, uneasy calculation of survival. And yet, even as the empire faced crisis, the essence of Napoleon endured. He was a man of unyielding vision, whose intellect, courage, and imagination had reshaped the world. In moments of reflection, he acknowledged the enormity of the challenge, the human cost of ambition, and the fragile architecture of power. He was aware, perhaps more than ever, that history is both generous and cruel, rewarding brilliance while punishing hubris, honoring courage while exposing vulnerability. The twilight of the empire had arrived not with a single catastrophic battle, but with the slow, inexorable erosion of advantage. Coalitions pressed forward, armies weakened, and the human and logistical toll of endless campaigns became impossible to ignore. Napoleon, ever the master of perception and strategy, adapted, recalculated, and pressed onward. But the cracks in the empire, once invisible, now ran deep and threatening. As evening fell over Paris, painting the Tuileries in a somber glow, Napoleon walked through corridors that had once resonated with triumph. The weight of history pressed upon him, and yet he remained a man of extraordinary resolve, intellect, and vision. The empire had reached its twilight, but the Emperor of Dreams endured, confronting the limits of ambition, the consequences of overreach, and the fragile human reality behind the legend. The horizon, waning yet still visible, held the quiet promise of reflection, resilience, and the inevitability of change. Napoleon pressed forward, step by step, decision by decision, through the unraveling of empire, through the shifting allegiances of nations, and through the profound solitude of a man whose genius had once seemed limitless. Twilight had come, yet the story of the Emperor of Dreams was far from complete. History, like time itself, waited for no one, and the next chapter of destiny was already being written in the hearts, minds, and battles yet to unfold. Chapter 8: Exile and Reflection. The Mediterranean sun cast a gentle glow over the island of Elba, illuminating hills, cliffs, and the turquoise sweep of the sea with a beauty at once serene and ironic. Here Napoleon Bonaparte, once master of Europe, now lived under the fragile truce of exile. The palaces of Paris, the battlefields of Europe, and the streets filled with the pulse of ambition were far behind him. The world he had commanded with genius and audacity had diminished into memory, rumor, and reflection. And yet, even in isolation, the presence of the emperor was palpable, as if ambition itself could not be restrained by geography or circumstance. Elba was a small kingdom, far removed from the vastness of his empire, yet the island demanded governance. Napoleon moved through its towns, ports, and hills with the same meticulous care he had once applied to European capitals. Roads were improved, ports developed, and local governance restructured, not from conquest, but from necessity. His mind, conditioned for strategy, order, and vision, could not simply rest. Even in exile, the act of shaping, organizing, and observing became both a solace and a subtle assertion of identity. He walked along the cliffs overlooking the sea, the wind tugging at his coat, and considered the passage of time. Ambition had carried him from Corsica to the heights of Europe, yet the brilliance of triumph had been tempered by the frost of Russia, the resilience of coalition powers, and the inexorable laws of history. Victory, he realized, is never permanent. Legend is fragile, and even the greatest dreams can falter under forces beyond control. Yet in this solitude, there was clarity, a chance to reflect upon both triumph and failure, to measure ambition against consequence, and to confront the human core beneath the myth. The island's inhabitants watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, aware that this man, small in scale, yet colossal in presence, had once reshaped the world. Soldiers who had followed him into endless campaigns were now scattered across Europe. Generals navigated uncertain political landscapes, and cities remembered his passage with awe, fear, and ambivalence. Napoleon's exile, like a pause in a symphony, offered a moment of stillness in which the resonance of his life could be heard with unusual clarity. In private moments, he revisited memories with meticulous precision: campaigns won and lost, battles fought and endured, alliances forged and broken. Each was a thread in a tapestry of ambition, consequence, and human will. He reflected upon the cost of power, the lives expended, the families disrupted, the nations reshaped by force of intellect and will. Even the greatest victories bore shadows, and the human toll, once abstract in the heat of triumph, now pressed upon him with the weight of undeniable reality. Josephine remained in memory a symbol of both love and impermanence. Their passions, intertwined with politics, personal ambition, and the burdens of empire, had left a legacy as delicate and complex as any battlefield maneuver. Napoleon understood that even the most brilliant strategy could not govern matters of the heart, and even the deepest attachment was subject to the fragile unpredictability of circumstance. Elba offered solitude, yet in that solitude, reflection illuminated both human vulnerability and enduring resilience. Yet exile did not diminish the mind of Napoleon. The intellect that had orchestrated entire continents continued to calculate, imagine, and strategize. Maps were reviewed, armies considered, and Europe, despite the distance, remained vivid in his imagination. The emperor understood that ambition, like history itself, could not be contained, and that even in the quiet isolation of Elba, the currents of destiny could be influenced by will, intellect, and timing. Reflection became a tool not only for understanding the past, but for envisioning the future, a future in which the contours of power might once again be reshaped. The Mediterranean breeze carried both freedom and isolation. Waves lapped against cliffs with a rhythm that reminded Napoleon of marches, campaigns, and battles long past. Nature, indifferent yet profoundly instructive, offered lessons in endurance, patience, and perspective. The human cost of ambition had been laid bare, yet the capacity to imagine, to influence, and to act remained. In exile, he discovered that even a man removed from the centers of power could find purpose in thought, planning, and the subtle exertion of influence. Elba, small and distant, became a crucible for reflection. Napoleon measured his ambitions against reality, triumph against consequence, and genius against the immutable laws of circumstance. He confronted the fragility of empire, the limitations of human endeavor, and the persistence of vision even when unmoored from opportunity. The island's quiet offered clarity. The Emperor of Dreams was no longer commanding armies, but he remained a master of strategy, intellect, and imagination. Even in exile, he shaped the narrative of his life, the lessons of history, and the seeds of future action. As the sun set over the cliffs, gilding the sea with molten gold, Napoleon walked slowly along the rocky shore. In the stillness, he felt both the weight of what had been lost and the latent force of what might still be achieved. Reflection, endurance, and imagination became weapons as potent as any cannon or battalion. The frost of Moscow, the twilight of the empire, the vast ambition and human cost, all were lessons engraved upon the mind and spirit of a man who had lived at the extreme edges of possibility. Napoleon, standing against the endless horizon of sea and sky, understood that even in exile, the story was not finished. Ambition endured, genius persisted, and history, though relentless, remained a canvas upon which a determined mind could act. Elba was not the end. It was a pause, a space for reflection, a test of resilience and vision. The Emperor of Dreams, tempered by frost and humbled by circumstance, remained a force to be reckoned with, a man whose mind and will had already left an indelible mark upon the world, and whose future, even in exile, was still unwritten. Chapter 9. The 100 Days. The Mediterranean breeze of Elba whispered of past victories and lingering ambition, but Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer content to watch history unfold from the sidelines. The island, tranquil and beautiful, had been a place of reflection, yet the mind that had reshaped Europe pulsed with restless energy. The Emperor of Dreams could not abide in exile while his destiny, his legend, waited on the distant shores of France. Every map, every report, every memory of loyalty and ambition converged into a single, inevitable decision. He would return. The journey was swift, audacious, and emblematic of the genius that had once commanded armies and capitals alike. A small fleet of ships carried him across the Mediterranean, their sails glinting in the sun, while in his mind strategy and perception intertwined. He calculated the loyalty of troops, the readiness of provinces, and the fractures within the coalition that now occupied his homeland. The world thought him constrained, diminished, yet in truth, Napoleon moved with the precision of a man whose imagination could once again bend circumstance to will. Landing at Gulf Juan, the coastline witnessed the first stirrings of legend renewed. Soldiers, local militias, and villagers, aware of the emperor's return, rallied with astonishment and devotion. Napoleon, ever attuned to perception, greeted them not merely with words, but with presence, a force of charisma that transformed admiration into action, uncertainty into loyalty. Each step inland, each town passed, became a tableau of resurgence. The whispers of the defeated were replaced by the cheers of the hopeful, and the tide of history began to shift once more under his influence. The march towards Paris was a crescendo of anticipation and drama. Troops who had served under him before, scattered and demoralized, rejoined with fervor, their loyalty rekindled by memory, hope, and the force of his will. The countryside, tense yet inspired, opened its roads and hearts to the returning emperor. No coalition army could intercept this carefully orchestrated movement, for Napoleon's genius lay not merely in conquest, but in the ability to anticipate and manipulate human expectation. France itself seemed to hold its breath, caught between the uncertainty of the present and the magnetic pull of its most audacious son. Paris, restless and wary, prepared for his return with a mixture of fear and fascination. Word spread swiftly. The emperor was coming, and with him the promise of glory, reform, and a resurgence of power. Ministers and officials debated loyalty and consequence, yet the momentum of history once again seemed to favor Napoleon. He entered the city not as a man diminished, but as a force reborn, riding the wave of expectation and the undiminished force of personal legend. The streets, filled with cheering citizens, testified to the enduring power of charisma, memory, and hope. During these 100 days, Napoleon ruled with a mixture of urgency and vision. Policies were enacted, orders issued, and strategy reconsidered, all with the same precision that had once carried his empire across Europe. Yet the context had changed. Europe had hardened, allies had aligned against him, and the coalition, now wary and coordinated, moved with determination to curtail his renewed power. Napoleon's genius remained unmatched, but the landscape was fraught with peril, and every action was measured against both immediate necessity and long-term consequence. The battles that followed were emblematic of his brilliance and audacity. Troops inspired by loyalty and admiration executed maneuvers that seemed miraculous, yet the sheer weight of coordinated opposition loomed. At Ligny, Quatre Bras, and ultimately Waterloo, the emperor's strategies reflected the mind of a master tactician, yet the limits of human endurance, the unpredictability of circumstance, and the determination of well-prepared adversaries revealed that even genius could be tested beyond measure. Every cannonade, cavalry charge, and infantry advance carried the duality of hope and danger, ambition and vulnerability. Amidst the frenzy of campaigns, Napoleon remained profoundly aware of the human cost. Soldiers, inspired and loyal, bore the brunt of strategy with courage, yet fatigue, fear, and injury were ever-present companions. Even amidst triumph, he felt the weight of mortality, the fragility of existence, and the impermanence of victory. The 100 Days, brilliant in audacity, was as much a testament to human resilience as it was to imperial ambition. Every maneuver, every decision was shadowed by the realization that fortune, like time, could shift with a single moment, a single miscalculation, a single stroke of fate. As the final confrontation loomed, the vast fields of Belgium became both theater and crucible. Napoleon, the man who had once bent Europe to his will, confronted the combined forces of coalition armies with intellect, courage, and audacity. Yet even the brilliance of his mind, the force of his presence, and the devotion of his followers were not enough to overcome the multitude of circumstances arrayed against him. Waterloo became the defining moment, a clash not only of armies, but of history, ambition, and human will. In the aftermath, the emperor's world shifted irreversibly. Defeat, though temporary in human terms, was permanent in its consequences. The coalition's strength, the exhaustion of his forces, and the limitations of circumstance forced a reckoning. Napoleon, ever conscious of legacy, understood that the 100 Days had been a final, brilliant flare of ambition and genius, a testament to resilience, imagination, and the human capacity to dream against adversity. Yet it was also a stark reminder that even the most extraordinary minds encounter limits imposed by time, circumstance, and the enduring currents of history. In the quiet that followed, Napoleon reflected upon the meaning of power, ambition, and consequence. His genius had reshaped Europe, inspired devotion, and altered the course of nations. Yet the human cost, the impermanence of victory, and the inevitability of resistance were inescapable truths. The 100 Days, brilliant and audacious, revealed both the heights of ambition and the fragility of empire. The Emperor of Dreams, once again humbled by circumstance, carried forward with clarity, vision, and the enduring spark of intellect that had defined a life extraordinary in scope and consequence. Chapter 10. St. Helena. The Atlantic winds were relentless, cold, and unyielding, a stark contrast to the gentle Mediterranean of Elba. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the master of Europe, now stood upon the rocky shores of St. Helena, a remote island far from the capitals, battlefields, and admiration that had defined his life. The world he had shaped with brilliance and ambition was now distant, yet his mind remained vivid, calculating, and reflective. Here, in isolation, he faced not armies, not coalitions, not the chaos of Europe, but the immensity of time, mortality, and legacy. The Longwood House, austere and windswept, became both prison and sanctuary. Walls that offered little comfort contained a mind that refused to rest. Napoleon's days were spent in study, correspondence, and contemplation. Books lined the rooms, maps sprawled across tables, and records of campaigns were meticulously reviewed. Even in confinement, he measured victories and defeats with precision, seeking lessons in both brilliance and failure. The island, distant and harsh, imposed limitations upon the body, yet could not constrain the intellect or the imagination of a man who had once reshaped continents. Isolation brought clarity. Napoleon reflected upon the trajectory of his life, the meteoric rise from Corsican origins to the heights of empire, the audacious campaigns that had altered nations, the alliances and betrayals, and the human cost of ambition. Each victory was hard won, each defeat a lesson carved in endurance and consequence. He contemplated the delicate balance between genius and overreach, between courage and hubris, and between the impermanence of power and the enduring nature of influence. In solitude, history became not just events to command, but a mirror for understanding the soul of a man who had lived beyond ordinary measure. Yet even in exile, Napoleon's mind remained a battlefield of strategy and imagination. He wrote memoirs, reflecting not only on military tactics, but on governance, diplomacy, and the shaping of nations. He dissected victories and failures with meticulous care, examining every decision, every maneuver, and every choice with the rigor that had defined his campaigns. These writings were both record and assertion, a way to shape perception even in the absence of command. The Emperor of Dreams, even diminished in circumstance, could not surrender the act of shaping history, of influencing minds, and of leaving an indelible mark upon the world. The human side of Napoleon emerged in these quiet moments. Memories of Josephine, of soldiers lost in battle, of cities conquered and people touched by his vision, surfaced with bittersweet clarity. The cost of ambition weighed heavily, yet even the weight of loss could not diminish the enduring spark of creativity, intellect, and resolve. In reflection, he recognized the paradox of greatness. To dream and achieve is to encounter both awe and suffering, and the measure of a life extraordinary lies in the courage to endure, to imagine, and to act despite inevitable limits. St. Helena was both punishment and teacher. The isolation imposed by the island's remoteness stripped away distractions, yet exposed the mind to its own depths. Napoleon walked the cliffs, watched the relentless waves, and considered the vastness of the world he had once sought to command. Nature, indifferent yet profoundly instructive, offered lessons in patience, humility, and perspective. Even as the body weakened under age and harsh climate, the intellect remained sharp, a flame enduring amid the cold winds of exile. He corresponded with friends, generals, and historians, asserting interpretations, defending strategies, and clarifying decisions. Each letter was both communication and reflection, a bridge between the reality of exile and the empire of thought that remained limitless in scope. Napoleon understood that while physical power was constrained, the influence of ideas, analysis, and narrative endured. The mind, once unleashed, could travel farther than armies, shaping perception and legacy even from the remotest island. As years passed, the physical world imposed undeniable limits. Illness, the cold, and isolation gradually eroded strength, yet the spirit persisted. Napoleon reflected not only on his own life, but on the nature of ambition, history, and human endeavor. He recognized the transient nature of power, the impermanence of glory, and the enduring impact of vision. In the quiet of Longwood, amid the wind and sea, he contemplated what it meant to live extraordinarily, to dream audaciously, and to leave a mark on the world that would endure beyond mortality.
The final days were marked with reflection, clarity, and acceptance. Napoleon, the man who had bent Europe to his will, who had inspired devotion and fear alike, now faced the ultimate horizon with dignity. Memory, intellect, and imagination remained vibrant, a testament to a life lived beyond ordinary bounds. The empire had fallen, the battles concluded, and the world had moved forward, but the mind of the emperor, the essence of ambition, and the spark of genius endured. As the sun set over the Atlantic, casting the rocky cliffs in molten gold, Napoleon looked toward the horizon. He understood that history is both generous and relentless, that ambition carries cost as well as triumph, and that greatness is measured as much by resilience and intellect as by victories and dominion. St. Helena, remote and austere, became the final stage of a life extraordinary, a place where reflection, endurance, and insight converge to illuminate the enduring power of vision. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of dreams, the master of Europe and architect of ambition, passed from the world not merely in body, but leaving a legacy beyond measure. The campaigns, victories, defeats, exiles, and reflections all composed a narrative of brilliance, audacity, and human complexity. Even in isolation, the story continued, echoing through time as testament to a life lived at the extreme edges of possibility, imagination, and consequence. Epilogue: The Measure of a Dream. History remembers Napoleon not merely as a man, but as an idea incarnate, the embodiment of audacity, intellect, and ambition pushed to its extreme. From the rugged shores of Corsica to the gilded halls of Paris, from the frozen plains of Russia to the wind-swept cliffs of St. Helena, his life was a journey of vision, triumph, struggle, and reflection. Each chapter of his existence was marked by brilliance tempered by consequence, courage shadowed by human fragility, and dreams tested by the immutable forces of time, nature, and history. He reshaped nations with the sweep of strategy, inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure, and demonstrated the capacity of a single mind to alter the trajectory of continents. Yet within that genius lay the human heart, capable of love, doubt, reflection, and humility. Victory was never absolute, defeat never final, for even in exile the force of intellect and imagination persisted, proving that the measure of a life extraordinary is not in unbroken triumph, but in the audacity to dream, act, and endure beyond the ordinary. Napoleon's empire, once vast and shimmering with conquest, now survives in memory, history, and the influence it cast upon law, governance, military strategy, and culture. The Napoleonic Code, the reshaped European borders, the very idea that a single man could dream beyond the conceivable, these remain like faint yet unyielding echoes of brilliance. In every city rebuilt, in every soldier inspired, in every thinker influenced by his audacity, the legacy endures. Yet perhaps the most profound testament to Napoleon lies in the human story itself, the paradox of genius and vulnerability, ambition and consequence. He confronted the limits of nature, the resilience of nations, and the weight of mortality with courage, intellect, and vision. He dared to imagine what others deemed impossible and to act with a decisiveness that reshaped reality itself.
and in doing so, he illuminated the fragile, extraordinary capacity of human potential. The horizons he pursued, bright with conquest, darkened by loss, distant in exile, reveal the essence of history. It is not simply the record of events, but the interplay of ambition, intellect, circumstance, and human will. Napoleon's journey from emperor of dreams to the reflective exile on St. Helena teaches that greatness is inseparable from struggle, and that the measure of a life extraordinary is found not only in what is achieved, but in the courage to dream, the persistence to endure, and the wisdom to reflect upon the passage of time. As the sun sets over the world he once sought to command, the story of Napoleon endures in memory and history alike. He remains a figure both human and mythic, a testament to audacity and intellect, and a reminder that even in the vast, indifferent flow of time, one life, driven by vision, ambition, and courage, can leave a mark upon the world that defies oblivion. The Emperor of Dreams, though gone from the earthly stage, continues to inhabit the imagination, the study, and the enduring chronicles of humanity. Napoleon's life was a symphony of brilliance.